This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Volume 2, Chapter 40, The Martyr. Deem not the just by heaven forgot, though life its common gifts deny, though with a crushed and bleeding heart, as spurned of man he goes to die. For God hath marked each sorrowing day, and numbered every bitter tear, and heaven's long years of bliss shall pay for all his children suffer here. Bryant. Note: this poem does not appear in the collected works of William Cullen Bryant, nor in the collected poems of his brother John Howard Bryant. It was probably copied from a newspaper or magazine. The longest way must have its close. The gloomiest night will wear on to a morning. An eternal, inexorable lapse of moments is ever hurrying the day of the evil to an eternal night, and the night of the just to an eternal day. We have walked with our humble friend thus far in the valley of slavery, first through flowery fields of ease and indulgence, then through heart-breaking separations from all that man holds dear. Again we have waited with him in a sunny island where generous hands concealed his chains with flowers, and lastly we have followed him when the last ray of earthly hope went out in night, and seen how, in the blackness of earthly darkness, the firmament of the unseen has blazed with stars of new and significant luster. The morning star now stands over the tops of the mountains, and gales and breezes not of earth show that the gates of day are unclosing. The escape of Cassie and Emmeline irritated the before surly temper of Legree to the last degree, and his fury, as was to be expected, fell upon the defenseless head of Tom. When he hurriedly announced the tidings among his hands, there was a sudden light in Tom's eye, a sudden upraising of his hands, that did not escape him. He saw that he did not join the muster of the pursuers. He thought of forcing him to do it, but, having had of old experience of his inflexibility when commanded to take part in any deed of inhumanity, he would not in his hurry stop to enter into any conflict with him. Tom therefore remained behind, with a few who had learned of him to pray, and offered up prayers for the escape of the fugitives. When Legree returned, baffled and disappointed, all the long-working hatred of his soul towards his slave began to gather in a deadly and desperate form. Had not this man braved him, steadily, powerfully, resistlessly, ever since he bought him? Was there not a spirit in him which, silent as it was, burned on him like the fires of perdition? "I hate him," said Legree that night as he sat up in his bed. "I hate him. And isn't he mine? Can't I do what I like with him? Who's to hinder, I wonder?" And Legree clenched his fist and shook it, as if he had something in his hands that he could rend in pieces. But then Tom was a faithful, valuable servant, and although Legree hated him the more for that, yet the consideration was still somewhat of a restraint to him. The next morning he determined to say nothing, as yet, to assemble a party from some neighboring plantations, with dogs and guns, to surround the swamp, and go about the hunt systematically. If it succeeded, well and good. If not, he would summon Tom before him, and, his teeth clenched and his blood boiled, then he would break the fellow down. Or there was a dire inward whisper to which his soul assented. Ye say that the interest of the master is a sufficient safeguard for the slave. In the fury of man's mad will, he will wittingly, and with open eye, sell his own soul to the devil to gain his ends. And will he be more careful of his neighbor's body? "Well," said Cassie the next day from the garret, as she reconnoitered through the knot-hole, "the hunt's going to begin again to-day." 3 or 4 mounted horsemen were curvetting about on the space in front of the house, and 1 or 2 leashes of strange dogs were struggling with the negroes who held them, baying and barking at each other. The men are, 2 of them, overseers of plantations in the vicinity, and others were some of Legree's associates at the tavern bar of a neighboring city, who had come for the interest of the sport. A more hard-favored set perhaps could not be imagined. Legree was serving brandy profusely round among them, as also among the negroes who had been detailed from the various plantations for this service. For it was an object to make every service of this kind among the negroes as much of a holiday as possible. Cassie placed her ear at the knot-hole, and, as the morning air blew directly towards the house, she could overhear a good deal of the conversation. A grave sneer overcast the dark, severe gravity of her face as she listened and heard them divide out the ground, discuss the rival merits of the dogs, give orders about firing, and the treatment of each in case of capture. Cassie drew back, and clasping her hands looked upward and said, "O great, almighty God, we are all sinners, but what have we done, more than all the rest of the world, that we should be treated so?" There was a terrible earnestness in her face and voice as she spoke. "If it wasn't for you, child," she said, looking at Emmeline, "I'd go out to them, and I'd thank any one of them that would shoot me down. For what use will freedom be to me? Can it give me back my children, or make me what I used to be?" Emmeline, in her childlike simplicity, was half afraid of the dark moods of Cassie. She looked perplexed, but made no answer. She only took her hand with a gentle caressing movement. "Don't," said Cassie, trying to draw it away. "You'll get me to loving you, and I never mean to love anything again." "Poor Cassie," said Emmeline, "don't feel so. If the Lord gives us liberty, perhaps he'll give you back your daughter. At any rate, I'll be like a daughter to you. I know I'll never see my poor old mother again. I shall love you, Cassie, whether you love me or not." The gentle, childlike spirit conquered. Cassie sat down by her, put her arm round her neck, stroked her soft brown hair, and Emmeline then wondered at the beauty of her magnificent eyes, now soft with tears. "Oh, Em," said Cassie, "I've hungered for my children, and thirsted for them, and my eyes fail with longing for them. Here, here," she said, striking her breast, "it's all desolate, all empty. If God would give me back my children, then I could pray." "You must trust him, Cassie," said Emmeline. "He is our Father." "His wrath is upon us," said Cassie. "He has turned away in anger." "No, Cassie, he will be good to us. Let us hope in him," said Emmeline. "I always have had hope." The hunt was long, animated, and thorough, but unsuccessful. And with grave, ironic exultation, Cassie looked down on Legree, as weary and dispirited he alighted from his horse. "Now, Quimbo," said Legree, as he stretched himself down in the sitting-room, "you just go and walk that Tom up here right away. The old cuss is at the bottom of this yar old matter, and I'll have it out of his old black hide, or I'll know the reason why." Sambo and Quimbo, both, though hating each other, were joined in one mind by a no less cordial hatred of Tom. Legree had told them, at first, that he had bought him for a general overseer in his absence, and this had begun an ill will on their part, which had increased in their debased and servile natures as they saw him becoming obnoxious to their master's displeasure. Quimbo therefore departed with a will to execute his orders. Tom heard the message with a forewarning heart, for he knew all the plan of the fugitives' escape and the place of their present concealment. He knew the deadly character of the man he had to deal with, and his despotic power. But he felt strong in God to meet death rather than betray the helpless. He sat his basket down by the roe, and, looking up, said, "Into thy hands I commend my spirit. Thou hast redeemed me, O Lord God of truth," and then quietly yielded himself to the rough, brutal grasp with which Quimbo seized him. "Aye, aye," said the giant as he dragged him along, "he'll cotch it now. I'll bound Massa's back's up high. No sneaking out now. Tell you, he'll get it, no mistake. See how you'll look now, helping Massa's niggers to run away. See what you'll get." The savage words, none of them reached that ear. A higher voice there was saying, "Fear not them that kill the body, and after that have no more that they can do." Nerve and bone of that poor man's body vibrated to those words, as if touched by the finger of God, and he felt the strength of 1,000 souls in one. As he passed along, the trees and bushes, the huts of his servitude, the whole scene of his degradation, seemed to whirl by him as the landscape by the rushing ear. His soul throbbed, his home was in sight, and the hour of release seemed at hand. "Well, Tom," said Legree, walking up and seizing him grimly by the collar of his coat, and speaking through his teeth in a paroxysm of determined rage, Do you know I've made up my mind to kill you?"
"It's very likely, massa," said Tom calmly.
"I have," said Legree, with a grim and terrible calmness, "done just that thing, Tom, unless you tell me what you know about these Argylls."
Tom stood silent.
"D'ye hear?" said Legree, stamping, with a roar like that of an incensed lion. "Speak!" "I hain't got nothing to tell, massa," said Tom, with a slow, firm, deliberate utterance. "Do you dare to tell me, you old black Christian, you don't know?" said Legree. Tom was silent. "Speak!" thundered Legree, striking him furiously. "Do you know anything?" "I know, massa, but I can't tell anything. I can die."
Legree drew in a long breath, and, suppressing his rage, took Tom by the arm, and approaching his face almost to his, said in a terrible voice,
"Hark ye, Tom, ye think 'cause I've let you off before, I don't mean what I say. But this time I've made up my mind, and counted the cost. You've always stood it out agin me. Now I'll conquer ye or kill ye, one or t'other. I'll count every drop of blood there is in you, and take 'em one by one, till ye give up."
Tom looked up to his master, and answered, "Massa, if you was sick or in trouble or dying, and I could save ye, I'd give ye my heart's blood; and if taking every drop of blood in this poor old body would save your precious soul, I'd give 'em freely, as the Lord gave his for me. Oh, massa, don't bring this great sin on your soul. It will hurt you more than 'twill me. Do the worst you can. My troubles be over soon. But if you don't repent, yours won't never end." Like a strange snatch of heavenly music heard in the lull of a tempest, this burst of feeling made a moment's blank pause. Legree stood aghast, and looked at Tom, and there was such a silence that the tick of the old clock could be heard, measuring, with silent touch, the last moments of mercy and probation to that hardened heart. It was but a moment. There was one hesitating pause, one irresolute, relenting thrill, and the spirit of evil came back with sevenfold vehemence, and Legree, foaming with rage, smote his victim to the ground. Scenes of blood and cruelty are shocking to our ear and heart. What man has nerve to do, man has not nerve to hear. What brother man and brother Christian must suffer cannot be told us even in our secret chamber, it so harrows the soul. And yet, O my country, these things are done under the shadow of thy laws. O Christ, thy church sees them almost in silence. But of old there was one whose suffering changed an instrument of torture, degradation, and shame into a symbol of glory, honor, and immortal life, and where his spirit is, neither degrading stripes, nor blood, nor insults, can make the Christian's last struggle less than glorious. Was he alone that long night, whose brave, loving spirit was bearing up, in that old shed, against buffeting and brutal stripes? Nay, there stood by him one, seen by him alone, like unto the Son of God. The tempter stood by him too, blinded by furious despotic will, every moment pressing him to shun that agony by the betrayal of the innocent. But the brave, true heart was firm on the eternal rock. Like his master, he knew that if he saved others, himself he could not save, nor could utmost extremity wring from him words save of prayers and holy trust.
"He's most gone, massa," said Sambo, touched in spite of himself by the patience of his victim. "Pay away till he gives up. Give it to him. Give it to him," shouted Legree. "I'll take every drop of blood he has, unless he confesses."
Tom opened his eyes and looked upon his master. "Ye poor miserable critter," he said, "there ain't no more you can do. I forgive ye with all my soul," and he fainted entirely away.
"I believe, my soul, he's done for, finally," said Legree, stepping forward to look at him. "Yes, he is. Well, his mouth's shut up at last. That's one comfort."
"Yes, Legree, but who shall shut up that voice in thy soul, that soul past repentance, past prayer, past hope, in whom the fire that never shall be quenched is already burning. Yet Tom was not quite gone. His wondrous words and pious prayers had struck upon the hearts of the imbruted blacks, who had been the instruments of cruelty upon him, and the instant Legree withdrew, they took him down, and in their ignorance sought to call him back to life, as if that were any favor to him.
"Sartain we's been doing a dreadful wicked thing," said Sambo. "Hopes masser'll have to count for it, not we."
They washed his wounds. They provided a rude bed of some refuse cotton for him to lie down on, and one of them, stealing up to the house, begged a drink of brandy of Legree, pretending that he was tired, and wanted it for himself. He brought it back and poured it down Tom's throat.
"Oh, Tom," said Quimbo, "we's been awful wicked to you."
"I forgive ye with all my heart," said Tom faintly.
"Oh, Tom, do tell us who is Jesus, anyhow," said Sambo.
"Jesus that's been a-standing by you so all this night, who is he?" The word roused the failing, fainting spirit. He poured forth a few energetic sentences of that wondrous one, his life, his death, his everlasting presence and power to save. They wept, both the two savage men.
"Why didn't I never hear this before?" said Sambo. "But I do believe. I can't help it. Lord Jesus, have mercy on us."
"Poor critters," said Tom. "I'd be willing to bar all I have, if it'll only bring ye to Christ. Oh, Lord, give me these 2 more souls, I pray." That prayer was answered. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41. The Young Master. 2 days after, a young man drove a light wagon up through the avenue of china trees, and, throwing the reins hastily on the horse's neck, sprang out and inquired for the owner of the place. It was George Shelby. And to show how he came to be there, we must go back in our story. The letter of Miss Ophelia to Mrs. Shelby had, by some unfortunate accident, been detained for a month or two at some remote post-office before it reached its destination. And of course, before it was received, Tom was already lost to view among the distant swamps of the Red River. Mrs. Shelby read the intelligence with the deepest concern, but any immediate action upon it was an impossibility. She was then in attendance on the sick bed of her husband, who lay delirious in the crisis of a fever. Master George Shelby, who in the interval had changed from a boy to a tall young man, was her constant and faithful assistant, and her only reliance in superintending his father's affairs. Miss Ophelia had taken the precaution to send them the name of the lawyer who did business for the St. Clairs, and the most that in the emergency could be done was to address a letter of inquiry to him. The sudden death of Mr. Shelby a few days after brought, of course, an absorbing pressure of other interests for a season. Mr. Shelby showed his confidence in his wife's ability by appointing her sole executrix upon his estates, and thus immediately a large and complicated amount of business was brought upon her hands. Mrs. Shelby, with characteristic energy, applied herself to the work of straightening the entangled web of affairs, and she and George were for some time occupied with collecting and examining accounts, selling property, and settling debts. For Mrs. Shelby was determined that everything should be brought into tangible and recognizable shape, let the consequences to her prove what they might. In the meantime, they received a letter from the lawyer to whom Miss Ophelia had referred them, saying that he knew nothing of the matter, that the man was sold at a public auction, and that, beyond receiving the money, he knew nothing of the matter. Neither George nor Mrs. Shelby could be easy at this result, and accordingly, some 6 months later, the latter, having business for his mother down the river, resolved to visit New Orleans in person, and push his inquiries in hopes of discovering Tom's whereabouts and restoring him. After some months of unsuccessful search, by the merest accident George fell in with a man in New Orleans who happened to be possessed of the desired information, and with his money in his pocket, our hero took steamboat for Red River, resolving to find out and repurchase his old friend. He was soon introduced into the house, where he found Legree in the sitting-room. Legree received the stranger with a kind of surly hospitality.
"I understand," said the young man, "that you bought in New Orleans a boy named Tom.
He used to be on my father's place, and I came to see if I couldn't buy him back." Legree's brow grew dark, and he broke out passionately,
"Yes, I did buy such a fellow, and a hell of a bargain I had of it, too. The most rebellious, saucy, impudent dog. Set up my niggers to run away. Got off 2 gals, worth 800 or 1,000 apiece. He owned to that, and when I bid him tell me where they was, he up and said he knew, but he wouldn't tell, and stood to it, though I gave him the cussedest flogging I ever gave a nigger yet. I believe he's trying to die, but I don't know as he'll make it out."
"Where is he?" said George impetuously. "Let me see him." The cheeks of the young man were crimson and his eyes flashed fire, but he prudently said nothing as yet.
"He's in that our shed,"
said a little fellow who stood holding George's horse. Legree kicked the boy and swore at him, but George, without saying another word, turned and strode to the spot. Tom had been lying 2 days since the fatal night, not suffering, for every nerve of suffering was blunted and destroyed. He lay, for the most part, in a quiet stupor, for the laws of a powerful and well-knit frame would not at once release the imprisoned spirit. By stealth there had been there, in the darkness of the night, poor desolated creatures who stole from their scanty hour's rest, that they might repay to him some of those ministrations of love in which he had always been so abundant. Truly, those poor disciples had little to give, only the cup of cold water, but it was given with full hearts. Tears had fallen on that honest, insensible face, tears of late repentance in the poor ignorant heathen whom his dying love and patience had awakened to repentance, and bitter prayers breathed over him to a late found Savior, of whom they scarce knew more than the name, but whom the yearning ignorant heart of man never implores in vain. Cassie, who had glided out of her place of concealment, and by overhearing learned the sacrifice that had been made for her and Emmeline, had been there the night before, defying the danger of detection, and moved by the last few words which the affectionate soul had yet strength to breathe. The long winter of despair, the ice of years, had given way, and the dark despairing woman had wept and prayed. When George entered the shed he felt his head giddy and his heart sick. "Is it possible? Is it possible?" said he, kneeling down by him. "Uncle Tom, my poor, poor old friend!" Something in the voice penetrated to the ear of the dying. He moved his head gently, smiled, and said,
"Jesus can make a dying bed feel soft as down pillows are."
Tears which did honor to his manly heart fell from the young man's eyes as he bent over his poor friend. "Oh, dear Uncle Tom, do wake, do speak once more. Look up. Here's Massa George, your own little Massa George. Don't you know me?"
"Massa George,"
said Tom, opening his eyes and speaking in a feeble voice. "Massa George." He looked bewildered. Slowly the idea seemed to fill his soul, and the vacant eye became fixed and brightened. The whole face lighted up, the hard hands clasped, and tears ran down the cheeks. "Bless the Lord! It is! It is! It's all I wanted. They haven't forgot me. It warms my soul. It does my heart good. Now I shall die content. Bless the Lord on my soul." "You shan't die. You mustn't die, nor think of it. I've come to buy you and take you home," said George with impetuous vehemence.
"Oh, Massa George, you're too late. The Lord's bought me, and is going to take me home, and I long to go. Heaven is better than Kentuck."
"Oh, don't die. It'll kill me. It'll break my heart to think what you've suffered, and lying in this old shed here. Poor, poor fellow."
"Don't call me poor fellow," said Tom solemnly. "I have been poor fellow, but that's all past and gone now. I'm right in the door, going into glory. Oh, Massa George, heaven has come. I've got the glory. The Lord Jesus has given it to me. Glory be to his name."
George was awestruck at the force, the vehemence, the power with which these broken sentences were uttered. He sat gazing in silence. Tom grasped his hand and continued, "Ye mustn't now tell Chloe, poor soul, how ye found me. 'Twould be so drefful to her.
Only tell her you found me going into glory, and that I couldn't stay for no one. And tell her the Lord stood by me everywhere and allus, and made everything light and easy. And, oh, the poor children and the baby. My old heart's been most broke for them time and again. Tell 'em all to follow me. Follow me. Give my love to Massa, and dear good missus, and everybody in the place. You don't know. 'Pears like I loves 'em all. I loves every creature everywhere. It's nothing but love. Oh, Massa George, what a thing 'tis to be a Christian!"
At this moment Legree sauntered up to the door of the shed, looked in with a dogged air of affected carelessness, and turned away.
"The old Satan!" said George in his indignation. "It's a comfort to think the devil will pay him for this some of these days." "Oh, don't. Oh, you mustn't," said Tom, grasping his hand. "He's a poor miserable critter. It's awful to think on it. Oh, if he only could repent, the Lord would forgive him now, but I'm afeard he never will."
"I hope he won't," said George. "I never want to see him in heaven."
"Hush, Massa George. It worries me. Don't feel so. He ain't done me no real harm, only opened the gate of the kingdom for me, that's all."
At this moment the sudden flush of strength which the joy of meeting his young master had infused into the dying man gave way. A sudden sinking fell upon him. He closed his eyes, and that mysterious and sublime change passed over his face that told the approach of other worlds. He began to draw his breath with long, deep inspirations, and his broad chest rose and fell heavily. The expression of his face was that of a conqueror.
Who shall separate us from the love of Christ?" he said, in a voice that contended with mortal weakness, and with a smile he fell asleep. George sat fixed with solemn awe. It seemed to him that the place was holy, and as he closed the lifeless eyes and rose up from the dead, only one thought possessed him, that expressed by his simple old friend: "What a thing it is to be a Christian!" He turned. Legree was standing sullenly behind him. Something in that dying scene had checked the natural fierceness of youthful passion. The presence of the man was simply loathsome to George, and he felt only an impulse to get away from him, with as few words as possible. Fixing his keen dark eyes on Legree, he simply said, pointing to the dead, "You have got all you ever can of him. What shall I pay you for the body? I will take it away and bury it decently." "I don't sell dead niggers," said Legree doggedly. "You are welcome to bury him where and when you like."
"Boys," said George in an authoritative tone to two or three negroes who were looking at the body, "help me lift him up and carry him to my wagon, and get me a spade." One of them ran for a spade, the other two assisted George to carry the body to the wagon. George neither spoke to nor looked at Legree, who did not countermand his orders, but stood whistling with an air of forced unconcern. He sulkily followed them to where the wagon stood at the door. George spread his cloak in the wagon, and had the body carefully disposed of in it, moving the seat so as to give it room. Then he turned, fixed his eyes on Legree, and said with forced composure, "I have not, as yet, said to you what I think of this most atrocious affair. This is not the time and place. But, sir, this innocent blood shall have justice. I will proclaim this murder. I will go to the very first magistrate and expose you."
"Do,"
said Legree, snapping his fingers scornfully.
"I'd like to see you doing it. Where are you going to get witnesses? How are you going to prove it? Come, now."
George saw at once the force of this defiance. There was not a white person on the place, and in all Southern courts the testimony of colored blood is nothing. He felt at that moment as if he could have rent the heavens with his heart's indignant cry for justice, but in vain.
"After all, what a fuss for a dead nigger,"
said Legree. The word was as a spark to a powder magazine. Prudence was never a cardinal virtue of the Kentucky boy. George turned, and with one indignant blow knocked Legree flat upon his face, and as he stood over him, blazing with wrath and defiance, he would have formed no bad personification of his great namesake triumphing over the dragon. Some men, however, are decidedly bettered by being knocked down. If a man lays them fairly flat in the dust, they seem immediately to conceive a respect for him, and Legree was one of this sort. As he rose, therefore, and brushed the dust from his clothes, he eyed the slowly retreating wagon with some evident consideration, nor did he open his mouth till it was out of sight. Beyond the boundaries of the plantation, George had noticed a dry, sandy knoll shaded by a few trees. There they made the grave.
"Shall we take off the cloak, massa?"
said the negroes when the grave was ready. No, no, bury it with him. It's all I can give you now, poor Tom, and you shall have it. They laid him in it, and the men shoveled away silently. They banked it up and laid green turf over it. "You may go, boys," said George, slipping a quarter into the hand of each. They lingered about, however.
"If young massa would please buy us," said one. "We'd serve him so faithful," said the other. "Hard times here, massa," said the first. "Do, massa, buy us, please."
"I can't. I can't," said George with difficulty, motioning them off. "It's impossible." The poor fellows looked dejected and walked off in silence. "Witness, eternal God," said George, kneeling on the grave of his poor friend, "oh, witness that from this hour I will do what one man can to drive out this curse of slavery from my land." There is no monument to mark the last resting place of our friend. He needs none. His Lord knows where he lies, and will raise him up, immortal, to appear with him when he shall appear in his glory. Pity him not. Such a life and death is not for pity. Not in the riches of omnipotence is the chief glory of God, but in self-denying, suffering love. And blessed are the men whom he calls to fellowship with him, bearing their cross after him with patience. Of such it is written, "Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted." End of chapter 41. Chapter 42. An authentic ghost story. For some remarkable reason, ghostly legends were uncommonly rife about this time among the servants on Legree's place. It was whisperingly asserted that footsteps, in the dead of night, had been heard descending the garret stairs and patrolling the house. In vain the doors of the upper entry had been locked. The ghost either carried a duplicate key in its pocket or availed itself of a ghost's immemorial privilege of coming through the keyhole, and promenaded as before, with a freedom that was alarming. Authorities were somewhat divided as to the outward form of the spirit, owing to a custom quite prevalent among negroes, and, for aught we know, among whites too, of invariably shutting the eyes and covering up heads under blankets, petticoats, or whatever else might come in use for a shelter on these occasions. Of course, as everybody knows, when the bodily eyes are thus out of the lists, the spiritual eyes are uncommonly vivacious and perspicuous, and therefore there were abundance of full-length portraits of the ghost, abundantly sworn and testified to, which, as if often the case with portraits, agreed with each other in no particular, except the common family peculiarity of the ghost tribe, the wearing of a white sheet. The poor souls were not versed in ancient history, and did not know that Shakespeare had authenticated this costume by telling how "the sheeted dead did squeak and gibber in the streets of Rome." Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 1, lines 115, 116. And, therefore, their all hitting upon this is a striking fact in pneumatology, which we recommend to the attention of spiritual media generally. Be it as it may, we have private reasons for knowing that a tall figure in a white sheet did walk, at the most approved ghostly hours, around the Legree premises, pass out the doors, glide about the house, disappear at intervals, and, reappearing, pass up the silent stairway into that fatal garret, and that in the morning the entry doors were all found shut and locked as firm as ever. Legree could not help overhearing this whispering, and it was all the more exciting to him from the pains that were taken to conceal it from him. He drank more brandy than usual, held up his head briskly, and swore louder than ever in the daytime. But he had bad dreams, and the visions of his head on his bed were anything but agreeable. The night after Tom's body had been carried away, he rode to the next town for a carouse, and had a high one; got home late and tired, locked his door, took out the key, and went to bed. After all, let a man take what pains he may to hush it down, a human soul is an awful, ghostly, unquiet possession for a bad man to have. Who knows the metes and bounds of it? Who knows all its awful perhapses, those shudderings and tremblings, which it can no more live down than it can outlive its own eternity? What a fool is he who locks his door to keep out spirits, who has in his own bosom a spirit he dares not meet alone, whose voice, smothered far down and piled over with mountains of earthliness, is yet like the forewarning trumpet of doom. But Legree locked his door and set a chair against it. He set a night lamp at the head of his bed, and put his pistols there. He examined the catches and fastenings of the windows, and then swore he didn't care for the devil and all his angels, and went to sleep. Well, he slept, for he was tired, slept soundly. But finally there came over his sleep a shadow, a horror, an apprehension of something dreadful hanging over him. It was his mother's shroud, he thought, but Cassie had it, holding it up and showing it to him. He heard a confused noise of screams and groanings, and with it all he knew he was asleep, and he struggled to wake himself. He was half awake. He was sure something was coming into his room. He knew the door was opening, but he could not stir hand or foot. At last he turned with a start. The door was open, and he saw a hand putting out his light. It was a cloudy, misty moonlight, and there he saw it, something white gliding in. He heard the still rustle of its ghostly garments. It stood still by his bed. A cold hand touched his. A voice said 3 times, in low, fearful whispers, "Come, come, come." And while he lay sweating with terror, he knew not when or how, the thing was gone. He sprang out of bed and pulled at the door. It was shut and locked, and the man fell down in a swoon. After this, Legree became a harder drinker than ever before. He no longer drank cautiously, prudently, but imprudently and recklessly. There were reports around the country, soon after, that he was sick and dying. Excess had brought on that frightful disease that seems to throw the lurid shadows of a coming retribution back into the present life. None could bear the horrors of that sick room, when he raved and screamed, and spoke of sights which almost stopped the blood of those who heard him, and at his dying bed stood a stern, white, inexorable figure, saying, "Come, come, come." By a singular coincidence, on the very night that this vision appeared to Legree, the house door was found open in the morning, and some of the negroes had seen 2 white figures gliding down the avenue towards the high road. It was near sunrise when Cassie and Emmeline paused, for a moment, in a little knot of trees near the town. Cassie was dressed after the manner of the Creole Spanish ladies, wholly in black. A small black bonnet on her head, covered by a veil thick with embroidery, concealed her face. It had been agreed that, in their escape, she was to personate the character of a Creole lady, and Emmeline that of her servant. Brought up from early life in connection with the highest society, the language, movements, and air of Cassie were all in agreement with this idea, and she had still enough remaining with her of a once splendid wardrobe, and sets of jewels, to enable her to personate the thing to advantage. She stopped in the outskirts of the town, where she had noticed trunks for sale, and purchased a handsome one. This she requested the man to send along with her; and accordingly, thus escorted by a boy wheeling her trunk, and Emmeline behind her, carrying her carpet-bag and sundry bundles, she made her appearance at the small tavern, like a lady of consideration. The first person that struck her after her arrival was George Shelby, who was staying there, awaiting the next boat. Cassie had remarked the young man from her loophole in the garret, and seen him bear away the body of Tom, and observed with secret exultation his rencontre with Legree. Subsequently she had gathered, from the conversations she had overheard among the negroes, as she glided about in her ghostly disguise after nightfall, who he was, and in what relation he stood to Tom. She therefore felt an immediate accession of confidence when she found that he was, like herself, awaiting the next boat. Cassie's air and manner, address, and evident command of money prevented any rising disposition to suspicion in the hotel. People never inquire too closely into those who are fair on the main point of paying well. a thing which Cassie had foreseen when she provided herself with money. In the edge of the evening a boat was heard coming along, and George Shelby handed Cassie aboard with the politeness which comes naturally to every Kentuckian, and exerted himself to provide her with a good stateroom. Cassie kept her room and bed on pretext of illness during the whole time they were on Red River, and was waited on with obsequious devotion by her attendant. When they arrived at the Mississippi River, George, having learned that the course of the strange lady was upward, like his own, proposed to take a stateroom for her on the same boat with himself, good-naturedly compassionating her feeble health and desirous to do what he could to assist her. Behold, therefore, the whole party safely transferred to the good steamer Cincinnati, and sweeping up the river under a powerful head of steam. Cassie's health was much better. She sat upon the guards, came to the table, and was remarked upon in the boat as a lady that must have been very handsome. From the moment that George got the first glimpse of her face, he was troubled with one of those fleeting and indefinite likenesses which almost everybody can remember and has been at times perplexed with. He could not keep himself from looking at her and watching her perpetually. At table, or sitting at her stateroom door, still she would encounter the young man's eyes fixed on her, and politely withdrawn when she showed by her countenance that she was sensible to the observation. Cassie became uneasy. She began to think that he suspected something, and finally resolved to throw herself entirely on his generosity, and entrusted him with her whole history. George was heartily disposed to sympathize with anyone who had escaped from Legree's plantation, a place that he could not remember or speak of with patience, and, with the courageous disregard of consequences which is characteristic of his age and state, he assured her that he would do all in his power to protect and bring them through. The next stateroom to Cassie's was occupied by a French lady named Dethau, who was accompanied by a fine little daughter, a child of some 12 summers. This lady, having gathered from George's conversation that he was from Kentucky, seemed evidently disposed to cultivate his acquaintance, in which design she was seconded by the graces of her little girl, who was about as pretty a plaything as ever diverted the weariness of a fortnight's trip on a steamboat. George's chair was often placed at her stateroom door, and Cassie, as she sat upon the guards, could hear their conversation. Madame Dethau was very minute in her inquiries as to Kentucky, where she said she had resided in a former period of her life. George discovered to his surprise that her former residence must have been in his own vicinity, and her inquiries showed a knowledge of people and things in his vicinity that was perfectly surprising to him.
"Do you know," said Madame Dethau to him one day, "of any man in your neighborhood of the name of Harris?"
"There is an old fellow of that name lives not far from my father's place," said George. "We never have had much intercourse with him, though."
"He is a large slave owner, I believe," said Madame Dethau, with a manner which seemed to betray more interest than she was exactly willing to show.
"He is," said George, looking rather surprised at her manner.
"Did you ever know of his having perhaps you may have heard of his having a mulatto boy named George?"
"Oh, certainly. George Harris. I know him well. He married a servant of my mother's, but has escaped now to Canada."
"He has?"
said Madame Dethau, quickly.
"Thank God!"
George looked a surprised inquiry, but said nothing. Madame Dethau leaned her head on her hand and burst into tears.
"He is my brother," she said.
"Madame," said George, with a strong accent of surprise.
"Yes,"
said Madame Dethau, lifting her head proudly and wiping her tears.
"Mr. Shelby, George Harris is my brother."
"I am perfectly astonished," said George, pushing back his chair a pace or two and looking at Madame Dethau.
"I was sold to the South when he was a boy," said she. "I was bought by a good and generous man. He took me with him to the West Indies, set me free, and married me. It is but lately that he died, and I was going up to Kentucky to see if I could find and redeem my brother."
"I heard him speak of a sister Emily that was sold South," said George.
"Yes, indeed, I am the one," said Madame Dethau. "Tell me what sort of
"A very fine young man," said George. Notwithstanding the curse of slavery that lay on him, he sustained a first-rate character, both for intelligence and principle. "I know, you see," he said, "because he married in our family."
"What sort of a girl?" said Madame Desault eagerly.
"A treasure," said George. "A beautiful, intelligent, amiable girl, very pious. My mother had brought her up, and trained her as carefully, almost, as a daughter. She could read and write, embroider and sew beautifully, and was a beautiful singer."
"Was she born in your house?" said Madame Desault.
"No. Father bought her once, in one of his trips to New Orleans, and brought her up as a present to mother. She was about 8 or 9 years old then. Father would never tell mother what he gave for her, but the other day, in looking over his old papers, we came across the bill of sale. He paid an extravagant sum for her, to be sure, I suppose on account of her extraordinary beauty." George sat with his back to Cassie, and did not see the absorbed expression of her countenance as he was giving these details. At this point in the story she touched his arm, and with a face perfectly white with interest, said,
"Do you know the names of the people he bought her of?"
"A man of the name of Simmons, I think, was the principal in the transaction. At least I think that was the name on the bill of sale."
"Oh, my God!"
said Cassie, and fell insensible on the floor of the cabin. George was wide awake now, and so was Madame Desault, though neither of them could conjecture what was the cause of Cassie's fainting. Still they made all the tumult which is proper in such cases, George upsetting a wash pitcher and breaking 2 tumblers, in the warmth of his humanity; and various ladies in the cabin, hearing that somebody had fainted, crowded the stateroom door and kept out all the air they possibly could, so that on the whole everything was done that could be expected. Poor Cassie, when she recovered, turned her face to the wall, and wept and sobbed like a child. Perhaps, mother, you can tell what she was thinking of. Perhaps you cannot. But she felt as sure in that hour that God had had mercy on her, and that she should see her daughter, as she did months afterwards, when but we anticipate. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43. Results. The rest of our story is soon told. George Shelby, interested, as any other young man might be, by the romance of the incident, no less than by feelings of humanity, was at pains to send to Cassie the bill of sale of Eliza, whose date and name all corresponded with her own knowledge of facts, and felt no doubt upon her mind as to the identity of her child. It remained now only for her to trace out the path of the fugitives. Madame Desault and she, thus drawn together by the singular coincidence of their fortunes, proceeded immediately to Canada, and began a tour of inquiry among the stations where the numerous fugitives from slavery are located. At Amherstburg they found the missionary with whom George and Eliza had taken shelter on their first arrival in Canada, and through him were enabled to trace the family to Montreal. George and Eliza had now been 5 years free. George had found constant occupation in the shop of a worthy machinist, where he had been earning a competent support for his family, which, in the meantime, had been increased by the addition of another daughter. Little Harry, a fine bright boy, had been put to a good school, and was making rapid proficiency in knowledge. The worthy pastor of the station, in Amherstburg, where George had first landed, was so much interested in the statements of Madame Desault and Cassie that he yielded to the solicitations of the former to accompany them to Montreal in their search, she bearing all the expense of the expedition. The scene now changes to a small, neat tenement in the outskirts of Montreal, the time evening. A cheerful fire blazes on the hearth, a tea-table, covered with a snowy cloth, stands prepared for the evening meal. In one corner of the room was a table covered with a green cloth, where was an open writing-desk, pens, paper, and over it a shelf of well-selected books. This was George's study. The same zeal for self-improvement which led him to steal the much-coveted arts of reading and writing amid all the toil and discouragements of his early life, still led him to devote all his leisure time to self-cultivation. At this present time he is seated at the table, making notes from a volume of the family library he has been reading.
"Come, George," said Eliza, "you've been gone all day. Do put down that book, and let's talk, while I'm getting tea, do."
And little Eliza seconds the effort by toddling up to her father and trying to pull the book out of his hand and instill herself on his knee as a substitute. "Oh, you little witch," said George, yielding, as in such circumstances man always must.
"That's right," said Eliza, as she begins to cut a loaf of bread. A little older she looks, her form a little fuller, her air more matronly than of yore, but evidently contented and happy as woman need be. "Harry, my boy, how did you come on in that sum to-day?" says George, as he laid his hand on his son's head. Harry has lost his long curls, but he can never lose those eyes and eyelashes, and that fine bold brow that flushes with triumph as he answers, "I did it, every bit of it, myself, father, and nobody helped me." "That's right," says his father. "Depend on yourself, my son. You have a better chance than ever your poor father had." At this moment there is a rap at the door, and Eliza goes and opens it. The delighted, "Why, this you?" calls up her husband, and the good pastor of Amherstburg is welcomed. There are two more women with him, and Eliza asks them to sit down. Now, if the truth must be told, the honest pastor had arranged a little program according to which this affair was to develop itself, and, on the way up, all had very cautiously and prudently exhorted each other not to let things out except according to previous arrangement. What was the good man's consternation, therefore, just as he had motioned to the ladies to be seated, and was taking out his pocket handkerchief to wipe his mouth so as to proceed to his introductory speech in good order, when Madame de Tou upset the whole plan by throwing her arms around George's neck and letting all out at once by saying, "Oh, George, don't you know me? I'm your sister Emily." Cassie had seated herself more composedly, and would have carried on her part very well had not little Eliza suddenly appeared before her in exact shape and form, every outline and curl, just as her daughter was when she saw her last. The little thing peered up in her face, and Cassie caught her up in her arms, pressed her to her bosom, saying what, at the moment, she really believed, "Darling, I'm your mother." In fact, it was a troublesome matter to do up exactly in proper order, but the good pastor at last succeeded in getting everybody quiet, and delivering the speech with which he had intended to open the exercises, and in which at last he succeeded so well that his whole audience were sobbing about him in a manner that ought to satisfy any orator, ancient or modern. They knelt together, and the good man prayed, for there are some feelings so agitated and tumultuous that they can find rest only by being poured into the bosom of Almighty love. And then, rising up, the new-found family embraced each other with a holy trust in Him who from such peril and dangers, and by such unknown ways, had brought them together. The notebook of a missionary among the Canadian fugitives contains truth stranger than fiction. How can it be otherwise, when a system prevails which whirls families and scatters their members as the wind whirls and scatters the leaves of autumn? These shores of refuge, like the eternal shore, often unite again in glad communion, hearts that for long years have mourned each other as lost; and affecting beyond expression is the earnestness with which every new arrival among them is met, if, perchance, it may bring tidings of mother, sister, child, or wife still lost to view in the shadows of slavery. Deeds of heroism are wrought here more than those of romance, when, defying torture and braving death itself, the fugitive voluntarily threads his way back to the terrors and perils of that dark land, that he may bring out his sister, or mother, or wife. One young man, of whom a missionary has told us, twice recaptured, and suffering shameful stripes for his heroism, had escaped again, and, in a letter which we heard read, tells his friends that he is going back a third time, that he may at last bring away his sister. My good sir, is this man a hero or a criminal? Would not you do as much for your sister, and can you blame him? But to return to our friends, whom we left wiping their eyes and recovering themselves from too great and sudden a joy. They are now seated around the social board, and are getting decidedly companionable. Only that Cassie, who keeps little Eliza on her lap, occasionally squeezes the little thing in a manner that rather astonishes her, and obstinately refuses to have her mouth stuffed with cake to the extent the little one desires, alleging, what the child rather ponders at, that she has got something better than cake, and doesn't want it. And, indeed, in 2 or 3 days, such a change has passed over Cassie, that our readers would scarcely know her. The despairing, haggard expression of her face had given way to one of gentle trust. She seemed to sink at once into the bosom of the family, and take the little ones into her heart, as something for which it long had waited. Indeed, her love seemed to flow more naturally to the little Eliza than to her own daughter, for she was the exact image and body of the child whom she had lost. The little one was a flowery bond between mother and daughter, through whom grew up acquaintanceship and affection. Eliza's steady, consistent piety, regulated by the constant reading of the sacred word, made her a proper guide for the shattered and wearied mind of her mother. Cassie yielded at once, and with her whole soul, to every good influence, and became a devout and tender Christian. After a day or two, Madame de Thou told her brother more particularly of her affairs. The death of her husband had left her an ample fortune, which she generously offered to share with the family. When she asked George what way she could best apply it for him, he answered, "Give me an education, Emily. That has always been my heart's desire. Then I can do all the rest." On mature deliberation it was decided that the whole family should go, for some years, to France, whither they sailed, carrying Emmeline with them. The good looks of the latter won the affection of the first mate of the vessel, and shortly after entering the port she became his wife. George remained 4 years at a French university, and, applying himself with an unintermitted zeal, obtained a very thorough education. Political troubles in France at last led the family again to seek an asylum in this country. George's feelings and views as an educated man may be best expressed in a letter to one of his friends. "I feel somewhat at a loss as to my future course. True, as you have said to me, I might mingle in the circles of the whites in this country, my shade of color is so slight, and that of my wife and family scarce perceptible. Well, perhaps on sufferance I might, but to tell you the truth, I have no wish to. My sympathies are not for my father's race, but for my mother's. To him I was no more than a fine dog or horse. To my poor heartbroken mother I was a child, and though I never saw her, after the cruel sale that separated us, till she died, yet I know she always loved me dearly. I know it by my own heart. When I think of all she suffered, of my own early sufferings, of the distresses and struggles of my heroic wife, of my sister, sold in the New Orleans slave market, though I hope to have no unchristian sentiments, yet I may be excused for saying I have no wish to pass for an American, or to identify myself with them. It is with the oppressed, enslaved African race that I cast in my lot, and if I wished anything, I would wish myself 2 shades darker rather than 1 lighter. The desire and yearning of my soul is for an African nationality. I want a people that shall have a tangible, separate existence of its own, and where am I to look for it? Not in Haiti, for in Haiti they had nothing to start with. A stream cannot rise above its fountain. The race that formed the character of the Haitians was a worn-out, effeminate one, and, of course, the subject race will be centuries in rising to anything. Where then shall I look? On the shores of Africa I see a republic formed of picked men, who by energy and self-educating force have in many cases individually raised themselves above a condition of slavery. Having gone through a preparatory stage of feebleness, this republic has at last become an acknowledged nation on the face of the earth, acknowledged by both France and England. There it is my wish to go, and find myself a people. I am aware now that I shall have you all against me, but before you strike, hear me. During my stay in France, I have followed up, with intense interest, the history of my people in America. I have noted the struggle between abolitionist and colonizationist, and have received some impressions, as a distant spectator, which could never have occurred to me as a participator. I grant that this Liberia may have subserved all sorts of purposes by being played off, in the hands of our oppressors, against us. Doubtless the scheme may have been used, in unjustifiable ways, as a means of retarding our emancipation. But the question to me is there not a God above all man's schemes? May he not have overruled their designs and founded for us a nation by them? In these days a nation is born in a day,
A nation starts, now, with all the great problems of republican life and civilization wrought out to its hand. It has not to discover, but only to apply. Let us, then, all take hold together, with all our might, and see what we can do with this new enterprise, and the whole splendid continent of Africa opens before us and our children. Our nation shall roll the tide of civilization and Christianity along its shores, and plant there mighty republics that, growing with the rapidity of tropical vegetation, shall be for all coming ages. Do you say that I am deserting my enslaved brethren? I think not. If I forget them 1 hour, 1 moment of my life, so may God forget me. But what can I do for them here? Can I break their chains? No, not as an individual. But let me go and form part of a nation which shall have a voice in the councils of nation, and then we can speak. A nation has a right to argue, remonstrate, implore, and present the cause of its race, which an individual has not. If Europe ever becomes a grand council of free nations, as I trust in God it will, if there serfdom and all unjust and oppressive social inequalities are done away, and if they, as France and England have done, acknowledge our position, then in the great Congress of Nations we will make our appeal, and present the cause of our enslaved and suffering race. And it cannot be that free, enlightened America will not then desire to wipe from her escutcheon that bar sinister which disgraces her among nations, and is as truly a curse to her as to the enslaved. But, you will tell me, our race have equal rights to mingle in the American Republic as the Irishman, the German, the Swede. Granted they have, we ought to be free to meet and mingle, to rise by our individual worth, without any consideration of caste or color, and they who deny us this right are false to their own professed principles of human equality. We ought, in particular, to be allowed here. We have more than the rights of common men. We have the claim of an injured race for reparation. But then I do not want it. I want a country, a nation of my own. I think that the African race has peculiarities yet to be unfolded in the light of civilization and Christianity, which, if not the same with those of the Anglo-Saxon, may prove to be, morally, of even a higher type. To the Anglo-Saxon race has been entrusted the destinies of the world during its pioneer period of struggle and conflict. To that mission its stern, inflexible, energetic elements were well adapted. But as a Christian I look for another era to arise. On its borders I trust we stand, and the throes that now convulse the nations are, to my hope, but the birth-pangs of an hour of universal peace and brotherhood. I trust that the development of Africa is to be essentially a Christian one. If not a dominant and commanding race, they are, at least, an affectionate, magnanimous, and forgiving one. Having been called in the furnace of injustice and oppression, they have need to bind closer to their hearts that sublime doctrine of love and forgiveness, through which alone they are to conquer, which it is to be their mission to spread over the continent of Africa. In myself, I confess, I am feeble for this. Full half the blood in my veins is the hot and hasty Saxon, but I have an eloquent preacher of the gospel ever by my side in the person of my beautiful wife. When I wander, her gentler spirit ever restores me, and keeps before my eyes the Christian calling and mission of our race. As a Christian patriot, as a teacher of Christianity, I go to my country, my chosen, my glorious Africa. And to her, in my heart, I sometimes apply those splendid words of prophecy, "Whereas thou hast been forsaken and hated, so that no man went through thee, I will make thee an eternal excellence, a joy of many generations." You will call me an enthusiast. You will tell me that I have not well considered what I am undertaking. But I have considered and counted the cost. I go to Liberia, not as an Elysium of romance, but as to a field of work. I expect to work with both hands, to work hard, to work against all sorts of difficulties and discouragements, and to work till I die. This is what I go for, and in this I am quite sure I shall not be disappointed. Whatever you may think of my determination, Do not divorce me from your confidence, and think that in whatever I do, I act with a heart fully given to my people. George Harris. George, with his wife, children, sister, and mother, embarked for Africa some few weeks after. If we are not mistaken, the world will yet hear from him there. Of our other characters we have nothing very particular to write except a word relating to Miss Ophelia and Topsy, and a farewell chapter which we shall dedicate to George Shelby. Miss Ophelia took Topsy home to Vermont with her, much to the surprise of the grave, deliberative body whom a New Englander recognizes under the term "our folks." Our folks at first thought it an odd and unnecessary addition to their well-trained domestic establishment. But so thoroughly efficient was Miss Ophelia in her conscientious endeavor to do her duty by her élève that the child rapidly grew in grace and in favor with the family and neighborhood. At the age of womanhood she was, by her own request, baptized, and became a member of the Christian church in the place, and showed so much intelligence, activity, and zeal, and desire to do good in the world, that she was at last recommended and approved as a missionary to one of the stations in Africa; and we have heard that the same activity and ingenuity which, when a child, made her so multiform and restless in her developments, is now employed, in a safer and wholesomer manner, in teaching the children of her own country. P.S. It will be a satisfaction to some mother, also, to state that some inquiries, which were set on foot by Madame de Thou, have resulted recently in the discovery of Cassie's son. Being a young man of energy, he had escaped some years before his mother, and been received and educated by friends of the oppressed in the North. He will soon follow his family to Africa. End of Chapter 43. Chapter 44. The Liberator. George Shelby had written to his mother merely a line, stating the day that she might expect him home. Of the death scene of his old friend he had not the heart to write. He had tried several times, and only succeeded in half choking himself, and invariably finished by tearing up the paper, wiping his eyes, and rushing somewhere to get quiet. There was a pleased bustle all through the Shelby mansion that day, in expectation of the arrival of young Massa George. Mrs. Shelby was seated in her comfortable parlor, where a cheerful hickory fire was dispelling the chill of the late autumn evening. A supper table, glittering with plate and cut glass, was set out, on whose arrangements our former friend, old Chloe, was presiding. Arrayed in a new calico dress, with clean white apron and high, well-starched turban, her black polished face glowing with satisfaction, she lingered, with needless punctiliousness, around the arrangements of the table, merely as an excuse for talking a little to her mistress.
"Laws, now, won't it look natural to him?" she said. "Thar, I set his plate just whar he likes it, round by the fire. Massa George allers wants the warm seat. Oh, go away. Why didn't Sally get out the best teapot? The little new one Massa George got for Mrs. Christmas. I'll have it out. And Mrs. has heard from Massa George?" she said, inquiringly.
"Yes, Chloe, but only a line just to say he would be home tonight, if he could, that's all."
"Didn't say nothing about my old man, s'pose?"
said Chloe, still fidgeting with the teacups.
"No, he didn't. He did not speak of anything, Chloe. He said he would tell all when he got home."
"Just like Massa George. He's allers so ferrous for tellin' everything hisself. I allers minded that ar in Massa George. Don't see, for my part, how white people generally can bear to have to write things much as they do, writing such slow, uneasy kind of work."
Mrs. Shelby smiled.
"I'm thinking my old man won't know the boys and the baby. Lor, she's the biggest gal now. Look, she is, too, and pert, Polly is. She's out to the house now, watching the hoe cake. I's got just the very pattern my old man liked so much a-baking, just such as I gin him the morning he was took off. Lord bless us, how I felt that ar morning!"
Mrs. Shelby sighed, and felt a heavy weight on her heart at this allusion. She had felt uneasy ever since she received her son's letter, lest something should prove to be hidden behind the veil of silence which he had drawn.
"Missus has got them bills?" said Chloe, anxiously.
"Yes, Chloe."
"'Cause I wants to show my old man them very bills the perfectioner gave me. And, says he, 'Chloe, I wish you'd stay longer.' 'Thank you, massa,' says I. I would, only my old man's coming home, and Missis, she can't do without me no longer. There's just what I telled him. Very nice man, that Massa Jones was." Chloe had pertinaciously insisted that the very bills in which her wages had been paid should be preserved, to show her husband, in memorial of her capability; and Mrs. Shelby had readily consented to humor her in the request. "He won't know Polly, my old man won't. Laws, it's been 5 years since they tuck him. She was a baby then. Couldn't but just stand up. Remember how tickled he used to be 'cause she would keep a-falling over when she sot out to walk. Laws a me." The rattling of wheels now was heard. "Massa George!" said Aunt Chloe, starting to the window. Mrs. Shelby ran to the entry door, and was folded in the arms of her son. Aunt Chloe stood anxiously straining her eyes out into the darkness. "Oh, poor Aunt Chloe," said George, stopping compassionately, and taking her hard black hand between both his. "I'd have given all my fortune to have brought him with me, but he's gone to a better country." There was a passionate exclamation from Mrs. Shelby, but Aunt Chloe said nothing. The party entered the supper-room. The money of which Chloe was so proud was still lying on the table. "Dar," said she, gathering it up and holding it with a trembling hand to her mistress. "Don't never want to see nor hear on't again. Just as I knew 'twould be. Sold and murdered on them our old plantations." Chloe turned and was walking proudly out of the room. Mrs. Shelby followed her softly, and took one of her hands, drew her down into a chair, and sat down by her. "My poor, good Chloe," said she. Chloe leaned her head on her mistress's shoulder, and sobbed out, "Oh, missus, excuse me, my heart's broke, that's all." "I know it is," said Mrs. Shelby, as her tears fell fast, "and I cannot heal it, but Jesus can. He healeth the broken-hearted, and bindeth up their wounds." There was a silence for some time, and all wept together. At last George, sitting down beside the mourner, took her hand, and with simple pathos repeated the triumphant scene of her husband's death, and his last messages of love. About a month after this, one morning, all the servants of the Shelby estate were convened together in the great hall that ran through the house, to hear a few words from their young master. To the surprise of all, he appeared among them with a bundle of papers in his hand, containing a certificate of freedom to every one on the place, which he read successively, and presented, amid the sobs and tears and shouts of all present. Many, however, pressed around him, earnestly begging him not to send them away, and with anxious faces tendering back their free papers. "We don't want to be no freer than we are. We's allers had all we wanted. We don't want to leave the old place, and Massa and Missis and the rest." "My good friends," said George, as soon as he could get a silence, "there'll be no need for you to leave me. The place wants as many hands to work it as it did before. We need the same about the house that we did before. But you are now free men and free women. I shall pay you wages for your work, such as we shall agree on. The advantage is, that in case of my getting in debt, or dying, things that might happen, you cannot now be taken up and sold. I expect to carry on the estate, and to teach you what, perhaps, it will take you some time to learn, how to use the rights I give you as free men and women. I expect you to be good, and willing to learn, and I trust in God that I shall be faithful and willing to teach. And now, my friends, look up and thank God for the blessing of freedom." An aged patriarchal negro, who had grown gray and blind on the estate, now rose, and lifting his trembling hand, said, "Let us give thanks unto the Lord." As all kneeled by one consent, a more touching and hearty Te Deum never ascended to heaven, though borne on the peal of organ, bell, and cannon, than came from that honest old heart. On rising, another struck up a Methodist hymn, of which the burden was, "The year of Jubilee is come, return, ye ransomed sinners, home." "One thing more," said George, as he stopped the congratulations of the throng. "You all remember our good old Uncle Tom?" George here gave a short narration of the scene of his death, and of his loving farewell to all on the place, and added, "It was on his grave, my friends, that I resolved before God that I would never own another slave, while it was possible to free him, that nobody, through me, should ever run the risk of being parted from home and friends, and dying on a lonely plantation, as he died. So when you rejoice in your freedom, think that you owe it to that good old soul, and pay it back in kindness to his wife and children. Think of your freedom every time you see Uncle Tom's Cabin, and let it be a memorial to put you all in mind to follow in his steps, and be honest and faithful and Christian as he was." End of chapter 44. Chapter 45. Concluding Remarks. The writer has often been inquired of, by correspondents from different parts of the country, whether this narrative is a true one, and to these inquiries she will give one general answer. The separate incidents that compose the narrative are, to a very great extent, authentic, occurring, many of them, either under her own observation or that of her personal friends. She or her friends have observed characters the counterpart of almost all that are here introduced, and many of the sayings are word for word as heard herself or reported to her. The personal appearance of Eliza, the character ascribed to her, are sketches drawn from life. The incorruptible fidelity, piety, and honesty of Uncle Tom had more than one development, to her personal knowledge. Some of the most deeply tragic and romantic, some of the most terrible incidents, have also their parallels in reality. The incident of the mother's crossing the Ohio River on the ice is a well-known fact. The story of Old Prue, in the second volume, was an incident that fell under the personal observation of a brother of the writer, then collecting clerk to a large mercantile house in New Orleans. From the same source was derived the character of the planter Legree. Of him her brother thus wrote, speaking of visiting his plantation on a collecting tour, quote, "He actually made me feel of his fist, which was like a blacksmith's hammer or a nodule of iron, telling me that it was calloused with knocking down niggers. When I left the plantation I drew a long breath, and felt as if I had escaped from an ogre's den." Unquote. That the tragical fate of Tom also has too many times had its parallel, there are living witnesses all over our land to testify. Let it be remembered that in all Southern States it is a principle of jurisprudence that no person of colored lineage can testify in a suit against a white, and it will be easy to see that such a case may occur wherever there is a man whose passions outweigh his interests, and a slave who has manhood or principle enough to resist his will. There is, actually, nothing to protect the slave's life but the character of the master. Facts too shocking to be contemplated occasionally force their way to the public ear, and the comment that one often hears made on them is more shocking than the thing itself. It is said, quote, "Very likely such cases may now and then occur, but they are no sample of general practice." Unquote. If the laws of New England were so arranged that a master could now and then torture an apprentice to death, would it be received with equal composure? Would it be said, quote, "These cases are rare and no samples of general practice"? Unquote. This injustice is an inherent one in the slave system. It cannot exist without it. The public and shameless sale of beautiful mulatto and quadroon girls has acquired a notoriety from the incidents following the capture of the Pearl. We extract the following from the speech of Hon. Horace Mann, one of the legal counsel for the defendants in that case. He says, quote, "In that company of 76 persons who attempted in 1848 to escape from the District of Columbia in the schooner Pearl, and whose officers I assisted in defending, there were several young and healthy girls who had those peculiar attractions of form and feature which connoisseurs prize so highly. Elizabeth Russell was one of them. She immediately fell into the slave trader's fangs, and was doomed for the New Orleans market. The hearts of those that saw her were touched with pity for her fate. They offered $1,800 to redeem her, and some there were who offered to give that would not have much left after the gift, but the fiend of a slave trader was inexorable. She was dispatched to New Orleans. But when about halfway there, God had mercy on her, and smote her with death. There were two girls named Edmondson in the same company. When about to be sent to the same market, an older sister went to the shambles to plead with the wretch who owned them, for the love of God to spare his victims. He bantered her, telling what fine dresses and fine furniture they would have. Yes, she said, that may do very well in this life, but what will become of them in the next? They too were sent to New Orleans, but were afterwards redeemed at an enormous ransom and brought back. End quote. Is it not plain from this that the histories of Emmeline and Cassie may have many counterparts? Justice, too, obliges the author to state that the fairness of mind and generosity attributed to St. Clare are not without a parallel, as the following anecdote will show. A few years since, a young Southern gentleman was in Cincinnati with a favorite servant, who had been his personal attendant from a boy. The young man took advantage of this opportunity to secure his own freedom, and fled to the protection of a Quaker who was quite noted in affairs of this kind. The owner was exceedingly indignant. He had always treated the slave with such indulgence, and his confidence in his affection was such that he believed he must have been practiced upon to induce him to revolt from him. He visited the Quaker in high anger, but being possessed of uncommon candor and fairness, was soon quieted by his arguments and representations. It was a side of the subject which he never had heard, never had thought on, and he immediately told the Quaker that if his slave would, to his own face, say that it was his desire to be free, he would liberate him. An interview was forthwith procured, and Nathan was asked by his young master whether he had ever had any reason to complain of his treatment in any respect. "No, massa," said Nathan, "you've always been good to me." "Well, then, why do you want to leave me?" "Massa may die, then who get me? I'd rather be a free man." After some deliberation, the young master replied, "Nathan, in your place, I think I should feel very much so myself. You are free." He immediately made him out free papers, deposited a sum of money in the hands of the Quaker, to be judiciously used in assisting him to start in life, and left a very sensible and kind letter of advice to the young man. That letter was for some time in the writer's hands. The author hopes she has done justice to that nobility, generosity, and humanity which in many cases characterize individuals at the South. Such instances save us from utter despair of our kind. But she asks any person who knows the world, are such characters common anywhere? For many years of her life the author avoided all reading upon or allusion to the subject of slavery, considering it as too painful to be inquired into, and one which advancing light and civilization would certainly live down. But since the legislative act of 1850, when she heard with perfect surprise and consternation Christian and humane people actually recommending the remanding escaped fugitives into slavery as a duty binding on good citizens, when she heard, on all hands, from kind, compassionate, and estimable people in the free states of the North, deliberations and discussions as to what Christian duty could be on this head, she could only think, these men and Christians cannot know what slavery is. If they did, such a question could never be open for discussion. And from this arose a desire to exhibit it in a living dramatic reality. She has endeavored to show it fairly in its best and its worst phases. In its best aspects she has perhaps been successful, but oh, who shall say what yet remains untold in that valley and shadow of death that lies the other side? To you, generous, noble-minded men and women of the South, you whose virtue and magnanimity and purity of character are the greater for the severer trial it has encountered, to you is her appeal. Have you not, in your own secret souls, in your own private conversing's, felt that there are woes and evils in this accursed system far beyond what are here shadowed or can be shadowed? Can it be otherwise? Is man ever a creature to be trusted with wholly irresponsible power? And does not the slave system, by denying the slave all legal right of testimony, make every individual owner an irresponsible despot? Can anybody fall to make the inference what the practical result will be? If there is, as we admit, a public sentiment among us, men of honor, justice, and humanity, is there not also another kind of public sentiment among the ruffian, the brutal, and the debased? And cannot the ruffian, the brutal, the debased, by slave law own just as many slaves as the best and the purest? Are the honorable, the just, the high-minded and compassionate, the majority anywhere in this world? The slave trade is now, by American law, considered as piracy. But a slave trade as systematic as ever was carried on the coast of Africa is an inevitable attendant and result of American slavery, and its heartbreak and its horrors, can they be told? The writer has given only a faint shadow, a dim picture of the anguish and despair that are, at this very moment, riving thousands of hearts, shattering thousands of families, and driving a helpless and sensitive race to frenzy and despair. There are those living who know the mothers whom this accursed traffic has driven to the murder of their children, and themselves seeking in death a shelter from woes more dreaded than death. Nothing of tragedy can be written, can be spoken, can be conceived, that equals the frightful reality of scenes daily and hourly acting on our shores beneath the shadow of American law and the shadow of the cross of Christ. And now, men and women of America, is this a thing to be trifled with, apologized for, and passed over in silence? Farmers of Massachusetts, of New Hampshire, of Vermont, of Connecticut, who read this book by the blaze of your winter evening fire, strong-hearted, generous sailors and ship-owners of Maine, is this a thing for you to countenance and encourage? Brave and generous men of New York, farmers of rich and joyous Ohio, and ye of the wide prairie states, answer, is this a thing for you to protect and countenance? And you, mothers of America, you who have learned by the cradles of your own children to love and feel for all mankind, by the sacred love you bear your child, by your joy in his beautiful, spotless infancy, by the motherly pity and tenderness with which you guide his growing years, by the anxieties of his education, by the prayers you breathe for his soul's eternal good, I beseech you, pity the mother who has all your affections, and not one legal right to protect, guide, or educate the child of her bosom. By the sick hour of your child, by those dying eyes which you can never forget, by those last cries that wrung your heart when you could neither help nor save, by the desolation of that empty cradle, that silent nursery, I beseech you, pity those mothers that are constantly made childless by the American slave trade. And say, mothers of America, is this a thing to be defended, sympathized with, passed over in silence? Do you say that the people of the free state have nothing to do with it, and can do nothing? Would to God this were true, but it is not true. The people of the free states have defended, encouraged, and participated, and are more guilty for it before God than the South, in that they have not the apology of education or custom. If the mothers of the free states had all felt as they should in times past, the sons of the free states would not have been the holders, and proverbially the hardest masters of slaves. The sons of the free states would not have connived at the extension of slavery in our national body. The sons of the free states would not, as they do, trade the souls and bodies of men as an equivalent to money in their mercantile dealings. There are multitudes of slaves temporarily owned and sold again by merchants in northern cities, and shall the whole guilt or obloquy of slavery fall only on the South? Northern men, northern mothers, northern Christians have something more to do than denounce their brethren at the South. They have to look to the evil among themselves. But what can any individual do? Of that every individual can judge. There is one thing that every individual can do: they can see to it that they feel right. An atmosphere of sympathetic influence encircles every human being, and the man or woman who feels strongly, healthily, and justly on the great interests of humanity is a constant benefactor to the human race. See, then, to your sympathies in this matter. Are they in harmony with the sympathies of Christ, or are they swayed and perverted by the sophistries of worldly policy? Christian men and women of the North. Still further, you have another power. You can pray. Do you believe in prayer, or has it become an indistinct apostolic tradition? You pray for the heathen abroad, pray also for the heathen at home, and pray for those distressed Christians whose whole chance of religious improvement is an accident of trade and sale, from whom any adherence to the morals of Christianity is, in many cases, an impossibility, unless they have given them from above the courage and grace of martyrdom. But, still more, on the shores of our free states are emerging the poor, shattered, broken remnants of families, men and women escaped by miraculous providences from the surges of slavery, feeble in knowledge and in many cases infirm in moral constitution, from a system which confounds and confuses every principle of Christianity and morality. They come to seek a refuge among you. They come to seek education, knowledge, Christianity. What do you owe to these poor unfortunates, O Christians? Does not every American Christian owe to the African race some effort at reparation for the wrongs that the American nation has brought upon them? Shall the doors of churches and schoolhouses be shut upon them? Shall states arise and shake them out? Shall the Church of Christ hear in silence the taunt that is thrown at them, and shrink away from the helpless hand that they stretch out, and, by her silence, encourage the cruelty that would chase them from our borders? If it must be so, it will be a mournful spectacle. If it must be so, the country will have reason to tremble, when it remembers that the fate of nations is in the hands of one who is very pitiful and of tender compassion. Do you say, "We don't want them here, let them go to Africa"? That the providence of God has provided a refuge in Africa is indeed a great and noticeable fact, but that is no reason why the Church of Christ should throw off that responsibility to this outcast race which her profession demands of her. To fill up Liberia with an ignorant, inexperienced, half-barbarized race, just escaped from the chains of slavery, would be only to prolong for ages the period of struggle and conflict which attends the inception of new enterprises. Let the Church of the North receive these poor sufferers in the spirit of Christ, receive them to the educating advantages of Christian republican society and schools until they have attained to somewhat of a moral and intellectual maturity, and then assist them in their passage to those shores where they may put in practice the lessons they have learned in America. There is a body of men at the North, comparatively small, who have been doing this, and as a result this country has already seen examples of men, formerly slaves, who have rapidly acquired property, reputation, and education. Talent has been developed, which, considering the circumstances, is certainly remarkable, and for moral traits of honesty, kindness, tenderness of feeling, for heroic efforts and self-denials endured for the ransom of brethren and friends yet in slavery, they have been remarkable to a degree that, considering the influence under which they were born, is surprising. The writer has lived for many years on the frontier line of slave states, and has had great opportunities of observation among those who formerly were slaves. They have been in her family as servants, and, in default of any other school to receive them, she has in many cases had them instructed in a family school with her own children. She has also the testimony of missionaries among the fugitives in Canada, in coincidence with her own experience. And her deductions, with regard to the capabilities of the race, are encouraging in the highest degree. The first desire of the emancipated slave, generally, is for education. There is nothing that they are not willing to give or do to have their children instructed, and, so far as the writer has observed herself, or taken the testimony of teachers among them, they are remarkably intelligent and quick to learn. The results of schools founded for them by benevolent individuals in Cincinnati fully establish this. The author gives the following statement of facts on the authority of Professor C. E. Stowe, then of Lane Seminary, Ohio, with regard to emancipated slaves, now resident in Cincinnati, given to show the capability of the race, even without any very particular assistance or encouragement. The initial letters alone are given. They are all residents of Cincinnati. B. Furniture maker, 20 years in the city, worth $10,000, all his own earnings, a Baptist. C. full black, stolen from Africa, sold in New Orleans, been free 15 years, paid for himself $600, a farmer, owns several farms in Indiana, Presbyterian, probably worth $15,000 or $20,000, all earned by himself. K, full black, dealer in real estate, worth $30,000, about 40 years old, free 6 years, paid $1,800 for his family, member of the Baptist Church, received a legacy from his master which he has taken good care of and increased. G, full black, coal dealer, about 30 years old, worth $18,000, paid for himself twice, being once defrauded to the amount of $1,600, made all his money by his own efforts, much of it while a slave, hiring his time of his master, and doing business for himself, a fine gentlemanly fellow. W, 3/4 black, barber and waiter, from Kentucky, 19 years free, paid for self and family over $3,000, deacon in the Baptist Church. G, D, 3/4 black, whitewasher, from Kentucky, 9 years free, paid $1,500 for self and family, recently died, age 60, worth $6,000. Professor Stowe says, "With all these except G I have been for some years personally acquainted, and make my statements from my own knowledge." The writer well remembers an aged colored woman who was employed as a washerwoman in her father's family. The daughter of this woman married a slave. She was a remarkably active and capable young woman, and by her industry and thrift, and the most persevering self-denial, raised $900 for her husband's freedom, which she paid, as she raised it, into the hands of his master. She yet wanted $100 of the price when he died. She never recovered any of the money. These are but few facts among multitudes which might be adduced to show the self-denial, energy, patience, and honesty which the slave has exhibited in a state of freedom. And let it be remembered that these individuals have thus bravely succeeded in conquering for themselves comparative wealth and social position, in the face of every disadvantage and discouragement. The colored man, by the law of Ohio, cannot be a voter, and, till within a few years, was even denied the right of testimony in legal suits with the white. Nor are these instances confined to the State of Ohio. In all States of the Union we see men, but yesterday burst from the shackles of slavery, who, by self-educating force, which cannot be too much admired, have risen to highly respectable stations in society. Pennington among clergymen, Douglas and Ward among editors, are well-known instances. If this persecuted race, with every discouragement and disadvantage, have done thus much, how much more they might do if the Christian Church would act towards them in the spirit of her Lord. This is an age of the world when nations are trembling and convulsed. A mighty influence is abroad, surging and heaving the world as with an earthquake. And is America safe? Every nation that carries in its bosom great and unredressed injustice has in it the elements of this last convulsion. For what is this mighty influence thus rousing in all nations and languages those groanings that cannot be uttered for man's freedom and equality? O Church of Christ, read the signs of the times. Is not this power the spirit of him whose kingdom is yet to come, and whose will to be done on earth as it is in heaven? But who may abide the day of his appearing? For that day shall burn as an oven, and he shall appear as a swift witness against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, the widow and the fatherless, and that turn aside the stranger in his right, and he shall break in pieces the oppressor. Are not these dread words for a nation bearing in her bosom so mighty an injustice? Christians, every time that you pray that the kingdom of Christ may come, can you forget that prophecy associates in dread fellowship the day of vengeance with the year of his redeemed? A day of grace is yet held out to us. Both North and South have been guilty before God, and the Christian Church has a heavy account to answer. Not by combining together to protect injustice and cruelty, and making a common capital of sin, is this union to be saved, but by repentance, justice, and mercy. For not surer is the eternal law by which the millstone sinks in the ocean than that stronger law
by which injustice and cruelty shall bring on nations the wrath of Almighty God. End of chapter 45, and end of Uncle Tom's Cabin.